The whole town said Elias Pruitt was wasting his life. They said it at the feed store, over coffee at Mabel's Diner on Main Street, and loud enough at Sunday service that Reverend Hogg had to clear his throat twice to regain the room. Elias Pruitt, they agreed, had spent good money on bad land, built a half-decent barn on ground that couldn't grow a head of wheat if you prayed over it from dawn to dusk, and had the nerve, the absolute nerve, to call it a horse operation. 63 acres of rocky Canadian Shield scrubland 40 kilometers outside of Harwick, Ontario. That was what Elias had purchased for $4,200 in the autumn of 1947, when every other man his age was buying decent farmland in the Huron County lowlands or taking over their father's established spreads. The people of Harwick looked at that rocky, thin-soiled parcel and saw exactly what it was. A fool's errand wrapped in fencing wire. They had known Elias since he was 12 years old. They remembered his father, a quiet, deliberate man who'd farmed oats east of town until the war took his health and the drought took his crops. They remembered Elias's wife, Catherine, who had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1944, leaving him with their son, Malcolm, not yet 3 years old, and a silence that seemed to move in and fill the space she'd left like cold air. Under a door. After Catherine, Elias rarely said more than he had to. He did his business at the general store with a nod and a list. He collected Malcolm from the schoolhouse with the same patience he applied to everything. Steady, unhurried, giving nothing away. If the grief was still in him, and it was, he did not wear it where people could see it. What he did wear, always, was a kind of immovable calm. It was the thing people found most unsettling about him. Not rudeness, not coldness exactly, but a stillness that made others feel, vaguely, that their opinions were passing through him, like weather through a tree, which was perhaps why, when he bought the Donnelly parcel in September of 1947, he said almost nothing in response to the questions, the frowns, the careful head shaking of men who considered themselves his betters in matters of land and livestock. Gordon Aldous at the Royal Bank had reviewed the paperwork and said, not unkindly, that he'd seen more promising terrain at the bottom of Georgian Bay. Elias had folded the bank draft into his coat pocket and said, might be. That was all, might be. He moved out to the Donnelly parcel that October, Malcolm riding beside him on the truck seat with a tin of biscuits on his lap, and his face pressed to the glass. The road out was rutted limestone and loose gravel, the bush pressing in on both sides, birch and poplar going gold. When they arrived, Malcolm climbed down and stood in the yard, if you could call it a yard, and looked at the low cabin, the sagging fence line, the field of exposed rock faces and patches of thin grass, and said, with the perfect honesty of a 6-year-old, it's not very good, is it, Dad? Elias looked at it for a long moment. Not yet, he said. He started with the fencing. Not the cabin, not the road, not the well, which was low and tasted of iron. The fencing first, because what he intended to do here required boundaries before it required comfort. He strung new wire along the east and north edges of the property, pulling posts with hands that were already cracked from the cold, working until the light failed and sometimes a little past it. Malcolm helped where a boy of 6 could help, which was mostly fetching and carrying and asking questions. Why was the wire that gauge and not thicker? Why set the posts that distance apart and not closer? Elias answered each question with the same patience he gave everything, because that gauge held without giving. Because that spacing let the wire do the work the post couldn't. The neighbors. What neighbors there were, the Teasdales 3 kilometers south, the Fontaine brothers to the west, watched with the polite skepticism of men who knew land. The Fontaine brothers, Armand and Denis, were third-generation farmers, and they had opinions the way some men had religion. Comprehensive, frequently shared, and not much open to revision. Rock and scrub, Armand said one afternoon, leaning on the fence line he shared with the Donnelly property. My grandfather tried to run cattle up here in the 20s, lost half of them first winter. Ground doesn't hold feed. I'm not running cattle, Elias said. What are you running? Horses. Armand exchanged a look with his brother. Dennis cleared his throat. "Horses need pasture same as cattle," he said, with the tone of a man explaining something to a child who should already know it. "Horses need more than pasture," Elias said, and he went back to his fencing. What the Fontaine brothers could not have known, and what Elias did not explain because explaining was not in his nature, was that he had spent the better part of 3 years reading, not land catalogs, not farming almanacs, though he had those too. He had read everything he could find about horses that people had given up on. Horses that came off the track broken in body or spirit. Horses that had been pushed too hard, handled too rough, traded too many times, and arrived in a new place already certain that trust was something that happened to other animals. He had written letters to a man in Guelph who had spent 30 years rehabilitating such horses. He had driven to Barry on 2 separate occasions to watch a woman named Constance Hale work with a thoroughbred gelding that had put 3 trainers on the ground and was scheduled to be destroyed. He had watched Constance Hale stand in that paddock and do almost nothing. Just breathe, just exist at a particular unhurried frequency, until the gelding stopped trembling and dropped his head and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Elias had driven home from Barry the second time and sat in his truck in the dark outside his cabin for 20 minutes. Not because he was upset, because he was thinking, because he had seen something that confirmed what he had already understood in his bones but needed to see outside of himself before he could be sure. He knew about damage. He knew about the particular silence that follows loss. He knew what it was to move through a world that kept insisting you should be different than you were, louder, more present, more willing to pretend the hurt wasn't there. He thought, though he never said this to anyone, that horses who had been broken and discarded understood something about that silence that most people never would. He thought he might be able to reach them. By the spring of 1948, the fencing was done. A small stable stood at the south end of the property. 4 stalls, rough but solid, the roof tight enough against Ontario rain, and Elias had acquired 2 horses. The first was a bay mare named Birch, 14 years old, retired from light driving work, who had developed a flinching terror of enclosed spaces after a barn fire 2 properties over had killed 3 of her companions. Her previous owner, a decent man named Ray Solberg, had tried everything he knew and then called Elias because word had begun, very quietly, to travel. The second was a gray gelding with no registered name, just a number on a lip tattoo, who had been a promising racehorse at Woodbine 3 years prior, had snapped a tint on the track, and had spent the intervening time being sold and resold, who had the space to keep him but not the patience to wait out what the injury had done to his trust. Neither animal was easy. Birch shook for the first 2 weeks in the stall, pressed against the back wall, nostrils flared, her eyes showing white. Elias put her grain just inside the stall door and sat outside it on an overturned bucket and read. Not to the horse, just in her vicinity. He brought the same unhurried frequency to that barn that he brought to everything. He did not push. He did not coax with the kind of insistent cheerfulness that horses who had been hurt recognized immediately as a human trying to get something. He simply occupied the space. Malcolm asked, one morning, why he didn't try to pet her. "She hasn't asked me to," Elias said. Malcolm sat with that for a while. "How will you know when she does?" "She'll tell me." The gray gelding, Malcolm eventually named him Scout, on the grounds that he was always looking at the far tree line as though planning a route, was a different kind of difficulty. He was not afraid, he was contemptuous. He had been pushed and rushed and sold by enough people that he had developed a comprehensive mistrust that expressed itself as disdain. He turned his back when Elias came in. He ate with the aggressive efficiency of an animal who has learned that food can be taken away. He tolerated handling with a stiff, mechanical compliance that was somehow worse than resistance. There was a morning in late April when Elias was in the paddock with Scout, doing nothing in particular. just standing at the center while the gelding moved around the perimeter, and Armand Fontaine came to the fence line and watched for a while before calling out, "You know he's not doing anything?" "I know," Elias said. "What are you waiting for?" Elias glanced at Scout, who had slowed at the far end of the paddock and was watching him with that flat, measuring gaze. "For him to get bored of being angry," Elias said. Armand shook his head and walked back to his own fields. The talk in Harwick in those first 2 years ran a particular course. It began as puzzlement, graduated to concern of the head-shaking variety, and settled into a kind of comfortable ridicule that the town applied to Elias the way it applied weather. Not maliciously, just as a fact of the landscape. Men at the feed store asked each other what that Pruitt fellow was actually doing out there, whether the horses were improving or whether they were just standing around in a field of rocks at taxpayer expense. They were not at taxpayer expense, but this detail did not slow the conversation. The Fontaine brothers, who were not bad men, were honest enough to admit that they watched the Donnelly property with a certain eagerness for evidence that they had been right all along. Reverend Hogg prayed generically for the wisdom of the community's farmers. Most people assumed this included Elias. Through all of it, Elias came into Harwick once a week for supplies, nodded at the men at the feed store, accepted the head shaking the way he accepted the weather, and drove back out to his 63 rocky acres. If their opinions landed on him, they did not stick. He had work to do. Birch walked out of her stall voluntarily for the first time on a Thursday in early May, a full 6 weeks after she'd arrived. She walked out and stood in the morning light with her head up, and Elias, who was at the fence with his coffee, did not move toward her. He stood where he was and let her have the space. She grazed for 20 minutes and walked back in on her own. Malcolm, watching from the cabin step, whispered, "Did she do it?" "She did," Elias said. Scout's change came slower and expressed itself differently, not in a single visible moment, but in a gradual, grudging decrease in the angle of his turned back. He stopped putting his hindquarters to Elias quite so consistently. He allowed grooming without the mechanical stiffness, then allowed it with something approaching acceptance. He was not warm. He was something more valuable than warm. He was honest. When Scout permitted something, it was because he had genuinely assessed the situation and found it not threatening. There was no performance in it. He was the least performative animal Elias had ever worked with. By the end of the second summer, word had reached further than Harwick. A woman named Vivienne Ashby, who bred standardbreds outside Orangeville, Hull, had heard about Elias's work from Ray Solberg, and she drove up in late August with a 3-year-old mare that she described, with a kind of frustrated affection, as brilliant and impossible. The mare, Fern, had impeccable bloodlines and had washed out of race training, not from injury or bad behavior. In the note, from what her train had with her, both sent with a refusal to compete. She would gallop beautifully on her own. In the presence of other horses, she simply stopped, slowed to a walk, looked around with an expression that suggested she found the entire enterprise beneath her. Vivienne Ashby was a practical woman who had little patience for sentiment and considerable patience for results. She sat in Elias's kitchen with her tea and explained the situation with a brisk clarity, and then said, "Ray Solberg says you're good at this. He didn't say why. I'd like to know why before I leave a valuable horse here." Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. Outside, Scout was moving along the near fence line with that long, unhurried stride that had developed over the past year, nothing like the tight, defensive circuit of his first weeks. "I don't try to change them," Elias said finally. "I try to understand what they decided about the world, and then I give them a reason to revisit it." Vivienne Ashby looked at him for a long moment. She had the assessing gaze of a woman who had been dealing with men who overpromised for 40 years, and it showed. "How long?" she said. "Depends on the horse. Ballpark. Fern." He glanced out at the paddock. 6 months. Could be 8. She left the mare. Fern arrived on a Saturday morning in a well-maintained trailer, and she stepped out of it with the air of a horse who had decided to be unimpressed by everything on principle. She was dark bay, almost black, and she moved with an effortless economy that made Elias think, watching her, of Catherine. Not because Catherine had been particularly horse-like, but because they shared a quality. The complete internal sufficiency of a creature who never needed anyone to tell them they were worth something. He stood at the paddock gate and let her walk the perimeter, and when she stopped at the far end and looked at him, he looked back. Just that. Just the acknowledgement of being seen. Malcolm was 11 by then, thin and serious, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's way of watching things before he spoke. He had grown up in the company of damaged horses and had absorbed, without ever being explicitly taught, the grammar of patience that defined his father's work. He asked good questions, waited for answers, and understood, in the way children understand things they have lived rather than been told, that some creatures need time the way they need food and water. Not as an indulgence, but as a basic requirement. He asked, standing at the fence beside his father, "What's wrong with her?" "Nothing's wrong with her," Elias said. "She just decided the race wasn't worth running." Malcolm considered this. "Can you change her mind?" "I can show her something worth running toward." The autumn of 1949 was when things shifted in Harwick, though shifts of that kind are rarely visible at the moment they happen. What people noticed first was Vivienne Ashby's name, which carried weight in standard-bred circles well beyond Simcoe County. She had told people about Elias Pruitt in Orangeville, in Guelph, at the fall fair in Fergus. She had said, with a particular economy of a woman who does not waste words, that he was the best she'd seen with a difficult horse, and that if you had something that wasn't working, he was the man to call. The calls came slowly at first. A retired racing manager from Hamilton with a mare who'd developed cribbing so severe she was destroying her own teeth. A family in Penetanguishene whose children's pony had been ruined by a previous owner and now couldn't be handled safely. A man named George Henley, who trained hunters outside Collingwood, with a gelding whose jumping is at only by his talent for depositing riders at the fence. Each of them arrived, assessed Elias and his rocky 63 acres with varying degrees of skepticism, and left their horses. Each of the horses improved. Not in spectacular, narrative-satisfying ways that could be easily reported back to the town. Not overnight transformations. In the patient, incremental, undeniable way that something genuinely working looks different from something being worked on. Birch, by the second autumn, could be stalled without trembling. Scout had developed a relationship with Malcolm that was the closest thing to demonstrative affection the gelding had ever shown. He would put his head over the fence when he heard the boy's voice, which, for Scout, was the equivalent of another horse jumping for joy. Fern, against every reasonable expectation, began running. She didn't race. She hadn't changed her mind about that. But she ran in the back field in the evenings when the light went golden, and she ran not from anything or toward anything, but simply because she was. It turned out, built for speed, and she had found a place where speed was its own reason. Elias watched her from the fence with his arms on the top rail, and his coffee going cold in his hand, and if he felt something large and quiet in his chest watching her, he kept it where he kept most things. The shift in Harwick happened the way shifts happen in small towns, through economy. When George Henley's gelding, the one who had bucked off 4 riders, came back from Elias Pruitt's property sound, mannered, and jumping clear, and George Henley won the hunter class at the Collingwood Agricultural Fair with him, people stopped asking what that Pruitt fellow thought he was doing out on those 63 rocks. They started asking if he had room for one more. The Fontaine brothers, to their credit, were among the first to say they'd been wrong. Dennis said it directly to Elias at the feed store one Friday afternoon in October of 1950, the kind of direct acknowledgement that costs a man something and is therefore worth receiving. "Didn't think it would work," Dennis said. "I was wrong about that." Elias nodded. "Ground surprised me too," he said. "Turns out some of it holds." It was the most he'd said in the feed store in 3 years. But what no one in Harwick knew about, what had happened on a morning in February of that year, in the cold pale light before the town had finished its breakfast, was the day that determined everything for Elias Pruitt, not in the way that newspaper stories get determined, but in the way that a man's understanding of himself gets settled. It had snowed hard, for 4 days running, then heavy Ontario snow that turns the bush silent and makes the roads into guesswork. The temperature had dropped to -23 overnight, and Elias had been out at 4 in the morning, checking the stable, breaking ice on the water troughs, adding extra bedding. He had been doing this every morning for a week, and he was tired in the deliberate way of a man who does not allow tiredness to change what he does. He was coming back from the far paddock, the one he used for new arrivals. There were 3 horses there, including a new one, a red roan gelding named Duncan, who had arrived 6 days ago from a racing stable in Woodstock in a state of such complete shutdown that Elias had spent the first 3 days simply sitting on a hay bale at the paddock gate, present but undemanding, letting Duncan decide whether existence in this place was worth attending to. On the morning of the 6th day, in the blue dark before dawn, with the snow still coming down, Elias had walked out to the paddock with grain and warm water, as he had every morning since Duncan arrived. He had set the bucket down inside the gate and stepped back, too pale to notice, and stood there. Steam rose from the bucket in the cold. His breath came in clouds. Duncan was at the far end of the paddock. He had not moved toward the gate in 6 days. He had eaten, but only once Elias had retreated fully to the fence line and given the horse the entire space between them. On that morning, Duncan moved. He didn't come quickly. He came the way a creature comes towards something when every instinct is still telling it to stay where it is. But something else, something quieter and more fundamental, is saying, carefully, that this might be different. He walked the length of the paddock in the dark and the snow and stopped 3 feet from Elias and stood there. Not at the bucket, not at the grain. He stopped in front of Elias. He dropped his head very slowly and put his nose against Elias's chest. Not a nudge, not the quick, curious investigation of a horse checking for food. He just rested there. A contact as deliberate and considered as a statement. The cold was -23. The snow was falling. Elias stood completely still with his hands at his sides and let Duncan rest his head against him and did not move and did not speak and felt something that had been held tightly in him for 6 years. Since a winter morning in 1944, when he had come home to find the cabin too quiet, loosen very slightly at its root. He did not cry. He was not that kind of man. But he stood in the dark and the snow with a damaged horse resting against his chest, and he understood, with the absolute clarity that sometimes arrives in the simplest moments, that he was doing exactly the right thing with his life. He had spent 3 years absorbing the town's judgment of his 63 rocky acres, his strange and quiet work, his refusal to explain himself. He had let it all pass through him like weather, through a tree. He had done this not from stubbornness, not from pride, but because he had known, not hoped, known, that the work was real, that it was necessary, that some creatures, once broken by the world, needed exactly what he had to give. A place where they were not required to perform recovery, not required to be grateful on a schedule, not required to earn their own worth back through demonstrable improvement. A place where they could simply be what they were and be waited for, and when they were ready, if they were ready, find that someone was still there. Duncan lifted his head eventually and turned and walked to the bucket and drank. Elias picked up his empty pail and walked back through the snow to the cabin, where the stove needed stoking, where the day was its ordinary things, where the day was already demanding its ordinary things. The sky was just beginning to go gray at the edge of the bush, that particular gray of a February morning in Ontario, which is one of the most honest lights in the world. He stoked the stove. He put the kettle on. He stood at the window and watched the snow, and thought about Catherine the way he still thought about her every morning, not with the raw weight of those first years, but with the particular tenderness of someone who had learned to carry a loss without being bent by it. He thought she would have understood what had happened in that paddock, not because she was sentimental about animals, but because she had understood him. She had known that his quietness was not emptiness. She had always known what was there. He drank his coffee. Outside, the snow kept falling on 63 acres that the town had called worthless and barren and a fool's investment. It fell on the stable where Birch slept without trembling. It fell on the paddock where Scout stood at the near fence, already listening for the sound of Malcolm waking. It fell on the far field where Duncan had walked, in the dark, the length of a paddock, to stand before a man who had simply waited. The ground, it turned out, had always held. It was just waiting for someone who understood what it needed. By the following spring, there was a 6-month waiting list for a place on Elias Pruitt's property. He never advertised. He never asked for recognition, and when the Harwick Weekly ran a piece on him in the summer of 1951, written by young Len Carey, who had just started at the paper, Elias agreed to the interview, but answered most of the questions in one sentence or less, and the piece ran under the headline, "Local Farmer Finn's Unusual Success with Troublebled Horses," which was accurate if not particularly illuminating. He framed it. He put it on the wall of the tack room, not because he needed the town's acknowledgement to know the work was good, but because Malcolm was 16 by then and read it 3 times and came out of the tack room with his face doing something careful and controlled, and Elias thought, you need that at 16. You need to see the world name something true about your father. That was enough. The horses kept coming. The seasons kept turning over those 63 acres of Canadian shield scrubland that had never been suitable for wheat or oats, or the opinions of men who measured land by what it could be forced to give. Elias worked through his 50s with the same unhurried steadiness he had brought to everything. Since Nallerans, since Catherine, the grief long since integrated into him the way iron integrates into good ground. Not gone. Just part of what he was made of now, part of what made him hold still when everything in a frightened creature wanted him to move. Scout died in the spring of 1957, 23 years old, and still turning his head when he heard Malcolm's voice from across the yard. Birch outlived him by 2 years. Fern ran in that backfield until she was too old to run and then stood in it, watching the light, which seemed to Elias a perfectly dignified arrangement. Duncan, the roan gelding from the Blue Morning in February, was never placed with anyone else. Some horses, Elias had come to understand, were not passing through, they were staying. He kept Duncan until the gelding was 25, and died in his stall on a quiet night in November. And when Elias found him in the morning, he stood for a long time in the door of the stable and let the moment be what it was. Malcolm grew up and became a veterinarian, which surprised no one who had watched him grow up among horses. He practiced in Collingwood, an hour south, but came back to the Donnelly property on weekends, and when Elias grew too old to manage the work alone, Malcolm rearranged things so he could be there more. He had his father's quietness and his mother's dark eyes, and a gift with animals that the town of Harwick eventually decided was simply how Pruitts were. And Elias, in his 70s, still walked out to the paddocks in the early mornings, still moved through the barn with that particular unhurried frequency, still sat on the overturned bucket with a book when a new horse needed to understand that this place was different. He was slower now. His hands hurt in the cold. The 63 acres looked different than they had in 1947. The fences were good. The stable had been expanded twice. There were proper paddocks where once there had been rock face and scrub. But the essential thing was unchanged. The essential thing was always this. A man who knew what damage looked like, standing at a distance that was respectful rather than indifferent, waiting without the insistence of need. letting a frightened creature take its time, arriving at the truth that not every human being in the world was going to break it. That was all it was. That was everything it was. And the horses who found their way to those 63 acres on the rocky edge of Harwick, Ontario, came broken by 100 different hands and histories. And they stood in the fields and learned the one thing they had forgotten. That trust, like good ground, was still possible. You just had to find someone who knew how to wait.